Welcome to part 1 of our urinary system lecture. This is going to match up to chapter 15 in your textbook and just the first part of it, so page 518 to 521. We're just going to start with the major structures and the major functions in the urinary system and talk a little bit about the kidneys. But since this is new, we're going to talk about a few things I want you to think about as you're listening to these lectures at home. First of all, these slides are just guides to what I think is important and what we're going to be focusing on in class. They're not the only thing you're responsible for. So please make sure you're not just printing out the slides, that you're taking notes as you would do in class, that you're listening to things I say in the narration. The things that I talk about are also important, but might not be written on the slide. Please make sure you're reading the textbook. While the textbook goes into more detail, it has a lot more explanation than we can cover in these 10, 15-minute lectures. And please pay attention to what we practice and work with in class. Some things to be looking for in every unit we do are terms and roots and prefixes that we've seen before. Things like cyto means scale, that peri means outer layer. You've seen these before. They can be clues to you so you don't have to start fresh in every unit. Think about how this system is going to interact with other systems we've learned about. We're going to talk about how the kidneys get their circulation, but you've already learned a lot about arteries and veins and how circulation works. Think about our main theme, which is how structure is related to function. Where do you see examples of that in the kidneys and in the urinary system? And then the big one for this system is, how does this help maintain homeostasis? Our body always needs to keep everything in balance, and that's really mainly what the kidneys are doing, is filtering things out and putting things back in balance in our blood. All right, let's start with the main functions of the kidneys. The kidney's main function is to produce urine. But why do we produce urine? The first thing we're doing is we're getting rid of what's called nitrogenous waste. And all this word nitrogenous means is that it's got nitrogen in it. These are waste products that are naturally made from the cells in our body doing their day-to-day business. The second thing it's going to do, and this is where homeostasis comes in, is regulate balance of a lot of things in our blood. It's going to make sure we have the right amount of water in our blood, the right amount of electrolytes. Remember, those are the salts, the ions like sodium and potassium that we need. It's going to balance those out in our blood, and it's going to keep the pH balance of our blood, how many acids and how many bases we have. The last thing that the urinary system does for us is make two important hormones. We've seen those before. We've seen both of these before when we did the endocrine system. Two hormones from the endocrine system actually get made by the kidneys, and those are renin. That's going to have to do with regulating our blood pressure, and erythropoietin, which has to do with making our red blood cells. The main structures you're probably pretty familiar with, this is pretty simple structurally, are the kidneys. There's two of them right here. They look just like kidney beans. The ureters, which are these tubes running from the kidneys down to our urinary bladder, and that's right here. That's going to store the urine until it's ready to be excreted through the urethra, which is this little tube that leads out of the body. One thing we'll get to a little bit later on is these things that sit right on top of the kidneys. These are our adrenal glands, also part of the endocrine system. This is what makes our adrenaline. All right, let's talk a little bit about the kidneys, since they're really where all the work is going on in the urinary system. This word is retroperitoneal, and it looks like a big word, and you probably are thinking you have no idea what it means. But retro means behind. You might hear it used to mean old. Something that's retro is something from the past. Okay, but it can also mean physically behind. So the kidneys are actually toward our back. They're tucked behind our other abdominal organs toward our back. Peritoneal is referring to the cavity where all of our abdominal organs are. So they're in the back of our peritoneal cavity. They're also in the superior, you know that means toward the top, lumbar, which is part of our spine region. So if you think of your lumbar spine, those lower vertebrae in your back, they're toward the top of those. So if you imagine them at the back side of you, tucked under the bottom of your rib cage, those are where your kidneys are, and they're not very big. Your book tells you they're only about the size of a bar of soap. They're going to need to be protected. They do get some protection from the rib cage, but they're not completely covered by that, so they have several layers of covering. First, the innermost layer that's directly covering the kidneys is called a fibrous capsule, and that's going to be made of fibrous tissue. It looks kind of glossy. That's nice and tough. Then they have a layer of fat. Peri, remember, means a covering, an outer covering. Renal, that word means kidney or having to do with the kidney. You're going to see that a lot. And it's a fat capsule, so it's made of adipose tissue. That's going to keep it cushioned, keep it warm, keep it protected. And lastly, the outermost layer is called the renal fascia, and that's a covering that's then going to anchor it to the muscles and things in the abdominal cavity to keep them in the right place. And this is really important. People who have rapid weight loss or who have damage to that fascia, the kidneys can drop too low, and this tube that's leaving with the urine can get kinked. Right now it's nice and open. Gravity is allowing that urine then to flow down to the bladder. If these were to sink down and pinch off that tube like pinching off a hose, then we have problems with being able to urinate. More serious problems can come from that. All right, there's three main regions of the kidney. The first is called the cortex, and that's this meaty part around the outer region. And that's where it's going to look really pink because there's a lot of circulation. That's where all the blood vessels are going. So it's getting lots and lots of blood flow all the time, which is what gives the pinkish reddish color of the kidneys. Next we have the medulla. That's in here, these things that look like pyramids, and in fact sometimes you'll hear them called the medullary pyramids instead of the renal medulla. And there's lots of them. And this is kind of where all the action that we're going to talk about in the next presentation is going on, where all the filtering of the urine and the blood goes on. Last we have the renal pelvis. That's this area in here. So each of these little pyramids in the medulla is going to drain when they're done with their filtering back in. These things are called calyxes, these little arms that reach in. Back into this pelvis. It's going to collect up the urine, and then that's going to flow down through the ureters to the bladder until it's ready to be excreted. Another word you might hear is renal columns, and that simply refers to these parts of the cortex that stick in to divide the pyramids. They don't really do anything other than divide up those pyramids so that they can be filtered individually. The last term I want to make sure you know is renal hilum, and that's this little indent on the side of the kidney here. And that's the area where everything comes in or out, so it's facing toward the medial part. Imagine our spine would be right here, our aorta would be right here, okay, and then if you go further over, there'd be another kidney. The hilum is where all the blood vessels, all the nerves, all the tubes for urine come in and out of the kidney. So we said before, it's especially important that the kidney is anchored and cushioned in its proper position. If it moves, it can pinch off everything that's coming in and out of this area. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture is the circulation pathway. Okay, if urine is produced in the process of regulating the balance of salts or electrolytes and water and acid and base in our blood, then really what urine is everything that's left over. After we filtered out our blood, urine is simply the water and the other waste products, the other electrolytes that we didn't need. So what's really happening, it's not so important that we're making urine, it's more important that we're filtering the blood and that what doesn't end up in our urine is going back to the blood. So let's talk about how does that blood get there and what happens when it gets there. This diagram I really like because it really just isolates the circulation. If you can imagine, our heart would be right up here. And it's pumping out nice red oxygenated blood to our aorta. And our aorta will travel down, and this is the abdominal aorta. So as it's traveling down through our abdomen, it's branching off to different places. And it will continue down to our pelvis and our legs, but part of it branches off, and some of that blood is going to travel into our kidneys. So these would be the renal arteries. Remember, arteries are things that are going away from the heart. They're pumping under high pressure. They're carrying oxygenated blood. So our blood is coming to our kidneys through the renal arteries, and then you can see it's going to branch out and really, really, really circulate well through that cortex area of the kidneys here. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about what happens in the medulla, how does it get filtered, how do we adjust its balance and cleanse it before we send it back. But let's assume that all that's happened magically right now. Then the blood that is left, that has already had its waste removed, already had its electrolyte balance and its pH balance and its water balance adjusted, and it's ready to go, is going to return into these little veins. And your book goes through all the names of those. I don't really expect for you to know them. It'll talk about things like cortical radiate veins and arcuate veins and interlobar veins. You don't need to know those. You just need to know that the blood will be filtered, and these veins, with all their fancy names, will dump into bigger and bigger and bigger veins until they come all together and exit through the renal, meaning kidney, veins. Okay. Now here's the thing I do want you to know. These renal veins come back to the vena cava, the inferior, meaning it's in the lower half of our body, vena cava, and that's going to go back to the heart. Okay, so blood from our legs that has had its oxygen dropped off and it's turned blue, it's no longer oxygenated, is coming back up through the vena cava. The renal veins meet the vena cava, and all of that blood travels back up to the heart. So it's not directly through the kidneys like that's their only stop. Oxygenated blood leaves the heart, comes down through the aorta. Some of it carries on to the rest of our body, but some of it stops to get cleansed, does its filtration here, leaves and joins the rest of that blood that's returning and goes back to the heart. Now you're saying, okay, so does all of our blood get filtered? Yes, eventually all of our blood will get filtered because our kidneys are working really hard. They are cleansing this blood, they're adjusting the composition and the balance of the blood, and they're doing this really fast. A quarter of our blood volume passes through our kidneys every minute. So any blood that, passed on and didn't make the turn into the kidneys this time, we'll get it the next time. And remember, it's all mixing together anyway. So as long as we're constantly cleansing and filtering, all of the blood is going to end up being filtered. Okay, that sums up part 1. You may need to watch this a couple of times. And again, it corresponds to page 518 through 521 in your textbook. So if you want more reading, you should be matching that up. Next, in part 2, we're going to talk about the nephrons, which are the tiny little units that are actually doing all this work of filtering and taking things out that we no longer want in our blood, making sure things go back in that we still need to keep, and doing all the real work of the kidneys. We'll talk about that in part 2.